works for state IT to be able to join to be able to actually accept the position. That's usually not a long process, but different departments do it differently. My hope is that they fill them pretty quickly. Because in addition to that one, we have at least 2 more that they need to fill. So I think that's something that needs to be communicated to them properly. Let's see. Beyond that, was there anything specific that anyone wanted to bring up?
There was something that I wanted to bring up, but I don't know if it might be something better to wait until everyone gets here, though. Or I can bring it up now.
We can always come back and fill them in.
Okay.
Sure. So what's up?
Okay. So hold on one sec. Trying to find the file. Okay, so I was reading the report and I ran it by the sustainability director,
Yes.
and he saw the streetlights section,
Mhm.
and I guess, and I wasn't aware of this, but apparently the city doesn't own. So I guess there's a difference between the streetlights and the poles.
Oh.
So let me actually, I'll share my screen.
Sure.
Just to give you a sense, because I wasn't aware of this either, and it's kind of hard to explain without a visual. So some of the streetlights or poles we own, and then some are owned by National Grid.
Mhm.
So the ones you see here, these 4 types. So this one, it's kind of like decorative. Those ones we own.
Okay.
But then National Grid owns these poles.
Right.
And in some cases, National Grid owns the poles, but we own the light, if that makes sense.
Okay. Well, what we would be doing, from what I understand of the receivers, they would actually be mounted on the light itself, on the light portion. So I think we'd still be okay. There may be a different cost depending on the type of pole, but if we could distinguish on the maps the poles we own versus the poles that we don't, that would be a helpful place for us to go. And then we can see if we still have a sufficient count to manage the net, to manage the kind of mesh approach that we were talking about. I believe that we would, but it may vary from one area to the next.
Okay. Yeah, and the city is currently working on the pilot program for the smart poles, which I believe I connected you with. I believe his name is Malik from Signify Smart Poles.
Yes.
So they're currently working on a pilot project to see like what they can affix to the lights and kind of how all the logistics work with that. So that's kind of in the works as well.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, because if it's a smart pole, they're doing data transmission back and forth, both receiving and transmitting, which basically is what we would be doing with the broadband mesh net network. The idea being that if you can transmit and receive one type of data, you can transmit more than one type of data. That's the same approach that Chattanooga took with their smart power grid, because they started out creating a smart power grid, and they said, well, if we do this too, then we get an added value for creating the grid. Okay. So that is something that we probably do want to talk to them more about. And I think that's something that should be set up as a meeting before we get too far along, just to sort of pick their brain and give them a clearer sense of what we're looking at as a potential way of doing this.
Well, it's going to come down to a question of bandwidth, right? Because
Yeah,
if the smart grid is just talking about lights and that kind of
they can
specific
use
transmission,
they can use a very narrow
yeah,
band. Yeah,
yeah.
and that's really it. So the question is, does it make sense to invest in something which has a wider bandwidth, which would include what they need for the lights, versus a narrower band, which then we have to add an extra piece on top of that.
So how big are the devices that would go onto the street lights?
That is an excellent question. That is an excellent question, and one that I do not have the answer to at this point. My impression was not that big.
So I think I know what part of the report you're referencing and stuff, where it's mentioned the possibility of using the street lights as a conduit to broadcast internet service.
Yeah.
And I think in that particular section, I mentioned that the city could possibly work with various telecom companies that are still kind of in the process of expanding 5G wireless service. And the idea being is that basically the city could use the portion of the streetlights that they own to try to make a deal with one of those major cell phone providers that could in turn generate revenue to support whatever municipal internet operation that we propose developing.
Right. There's only a couple little problems with that I see. One at least one of the bigs, if not the biggest at this point, which is the Verizon Fios, has already said in certain terms they absolutely will not expand into the city of Albany. They won't do it.
Not necessarily that. Verizon's made it clear that they're just not expanding their Fios service, but they definitely would like to expand their 5G wideband service, the service that the cell phones are using.
Well, right. I mean, the only thing is, part of the challenge with this is that we're trying to create a lower cost alternative. That's the other challenge. Right now, the city's traditional approach to both cable and internet service has been, okay, we'll set up a contract. Whoever gets the bid, that's who we went with. That's how we wound up with Comcast Spectrum, which even the people paying for it pretty much hate. The advantage of going with our own self-managed network, and I agree with you, it's still an option that we still need to put on the table of could we work through a third party, is that we would have better control over pricing. Is the risk greater because of cost and we have to find a way to pay for getting the equipment, getting it up, managing it? Yes. A middle ground would be to look at an independent tech and technical provider, not affiliated with one of the bigs, which a lot of communities have done, to basically build the network for us, and then have it managed by a broadband authority created by the city itself as a quasi-governmental body, which has the ability to bond, set rates, etc. The question is, what would give the greatest return on investment, and the greatest amount of control to the city and its people. Sort of a middle ground between what you were talking about and that would be for the city to create a dark fiber network and lease space on that network to the big providers in exchange for a fee. That has had mixed results depending on the community. as I say, the best model, the ideal national model from what we're hearing by most sources is Chattanooga, which is close to us in size, has much of the same population demographics. And they went with the independent authority model, which they actually managed, not as a dark fiber, but as an active fiber broadband network.
And they just had the history of the Tennessee Valley Authority to kind of pull on, right?
They did. That's the edit. That's where they did that for the actual power provision for the smart grid. So the actual power provider is the still the Tennessee Valley Authority. They provide the actual power. The smart grid itself is actually is not the Tennessee Valley Authority. That's the actual city of Chattanooga. We've created the Electronic Power Board, which is called EPB, which manages both the smart power grid and the broadband. So in a sense, National Grid is our power provider pretty much for the city.
Mm-hmm.
We could, in theory, create a smart grid where National Grid would still provide the power, but we would manage the grid. So basically, all the data transmission, all the technical aspects of that would be managed by an authority created by the city. I personally wouldn't recommend that because National Grid does a pretty good job of that, particularly during storms. So we have a good model with them right now. We have a good working relationship with them. There were a lot of jobs tied to them. So the need for a smart grid authority, smart power grid here, you could question.
Does their smart power grid in Chattanooga allow chargebacks? Like if if a homeowner puts solar panels, they can put back into the grid? Yeah. Okay.
Absolutely. I mean, that's the thing too. We could do that. If the problem is we're a population dense city, but in theory, if you wanted to put solar panels up on the roof of your buildings, if you have some land as you go out towards the edge of the city and you set up panels or wind or anything else that you wanted to do, you could do that. For instance, there's the proposal to put wind power in the middle of the river. That would be a power generator. National Grid would buy that power back, or the smart grid
would love that.
Yeah, and so you'd be taking advantage of the waterfront, which was done for many decades, and at the same time, you'd be reducing the cost of power. So it's something to think about. As again, these are all things to look at long term. What makes the most sense for the city? Unlike Chattanooga, which did the smart power grid first and then said, "Oh, gee, we can do broadband too," it might make sense for us to do the broadband first and then have the added capacity. So if we wanted to pursue a smart power grid at some point, we could do it. In this case, we have as our precursor is the light pole project being run through the sustainability committee. Smaller scale, but still valuable. So they did the initial work. We know where our poles are. We know where National Grid's poles are. They've done research as to what bands they need for their narrow band technology. We can now look at what we would need for broadband that might include those bands and get a better return on investment by buying technology which incorporates both. And that's a thing for us to think about, for the city to think about. There are options. I mean, I think it was a huge boost for us when we were able to finally look at maps showing where the poles were. We were able to see that there are a ton of poles throughout the city, in every part of the city. That's what I'm saying is what we need to do now is distinguish between those the city actually owns and see if that would be sufficient for our needs. Or if we would need to incorporate in some way a portion of those that are still owned by National Grid as well, and how open they'd be to that and what they might charge.
If you would like, I could set up a meeting with the sustainability director.
I think that would be a great idea.
Yeah, because he's like the guru on streetlights and street poles. So I think he would be able to offer a lot of good information around that.
I think that would be great. If we could get him into one of these meetings and actually will give us enough time to make sure that we get everybody here. I would suggest probably on a Tuesday night, if that works for people, but we'll set it up to according to what he can do, of course.
Okay.
But I think that would be a good approach, because I know that Diana's going to have a lot of questions. We're all going to have a lot of questions for him, and I'd like to make the most of that meeting.
Now, would you want to do it during the regular scheduled meeting or just a
I
different?
would think so. Yeah, let's have him as like our guest speaker, sort of role.
Okay, I'll reach out to him and see if he's available.
Great, thank you. Because I think that would be beneficial, certainly for her part of the report, and Martin, I think it would have some effect on your part of the report as well for the final report. So that you would look at the cost, Diana would look at the tech.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Because I think that would give us a way to get some hard math, one might hope, for what the city's already looking at, and what we can expand to. But I mean, part of this is going to be, and this is for us for the next few months, is starting to track down firms that deal in this kind of broadband mesh tech and what they charge. You know, what are the technical specs, what are the cost specs for that type of technology, and versus what volume of those the city would need to create a true mesh network. Because the model that I said, usually with those you have at least 3 nodes that are connected to each other, so in case one goes down, the other 2 pick up the slack, to keep the service going and keep up the levels that they expect. So we need to think in terms of 3 of what we need for, it's not just 1 for each pole, but 3 poles, and how close are they and how well do they link together? What's the distance? What's the bandwidth? I think that will help us. And hopefully we get a couple extra bodies here to help with that. Jess, can you get me to, I have the email for Kate and Caitlin, but I don't have her phone, I don't believe. If you have that, can you email me that?
Sorry, what was that? You broke up a little bit.
Sorry. I have the email for Kate and Caitlin, but I don't have a phone for her. If you have that, can you get that to me?
Sure. I think I might have one. Let me check.
Great, thank you. I just want to touch base and see where she is at, because I know she was planning to come back and then we haven't heard from her. So I just want to be sure that things are still on course or what she wants to do. And hopefully as we get into fall, it'll free people up a little bit more to come to the meetings. The other thing we can examine is, does it make sense to still do this on Thursday nights, or do we want to go back to a night earlier in the week that works better for the entire group? which I'm very willing to do. Whatever makes the most sense. Okay. Well, I don't know that Diana's going to make it. Let me see if we have an email from her here. No email there. Okay. Well, barring.
I do for Caitlin. I can text it to you.
Thanks. That would be great. All right. Well, gentlemen, and lady, I'm going to say it's 25 past the hour, and I doubt we're getting anyone else tonight. So we've confirmed that the report is in. Jess is going to try and set up a meeting with the sustainability chair. And then we'll start to explore costs and what feedback comes back from the Common Council and the mayor. Thank you, Jess. Got that now. Perfect. Is there anything else that anyone wanted to bring up at all? Or because if not, we can wrap this one up.
Nope.
Okay, Luke. Martin, what about you?
No, I have no other comments.
Okay, great. All right. If that's it, I'm going to suggest that we call the meeting since we don't have a quorum at this point anyway. Thanks for coming, and we'll see you at the next meeting.